He was last seen feeding a lamb with his kindergarten class, his laughter echoing across the sunlit pens of the Willow Acres petting zoo. Then he vanished. No footprints, no witnesses, no clues. For 12 years, his name haunted missing child flyers and shattered a family. Until one summer morning, a goat farm owner in a neighboring town climbed into his hayloft and saw a pair of eyes watching him from the shadows. The buses pulled into the gravel parking lot just after 9:00 a.m., their brakes hissing and chugging in unison as excited children pressed their faces to the windows. Willow Acres Petting Zoo stood beyond a white picket fence, its rustic charm perfectly crafted for field trips and birthday parties. The air carried the mingled scent of hay, animal musk, and kettle corn from a nearby snack stand. Teachers barked roll calls over the din of squealing kindergartners, who could hardly contain their excitement as they spilled out onto the path, clutching permission slips and sack lunches. Among them was 6-year-old Noah Franklin, his mop of dirty blonde hair falling into eyes too wide for his small face. He held tight to his teacher's hand, his neon green backpack bouncing behind him with each eager step. His mother had packed his favorite sandwich peanut butter and banana and slipped in a handwritten note with a smiley face. His class had been talking about this trip for weeks, and today, the animals had finally arrived to meet them. Noah darted between pens with his classmates, marveling at the goats, sheep, and ponies. He laughed when a lamb nibbled the edge of his sleeve and giggled as a rabbit wiggled its nose inches from his own. Parents circled nearby, snapping pictures, chatting about dinner plans, enjoying the novelty of the outing. Everything felt safe, normal. The kind of memory a child stores away, sun-drenched and innocent. At 10:37 a.m., the head count was one short. "Noah," his teacher called, shielding her eyes against the glare of the late morning sun. She scanned the group again. 23 children. 24 had come. The first 5 minutes were brushed off with optimism. Maybe he wandered to the pony ride line. Maybe he went to the restroom with a chaperone. But when neither possibility panned out, the tone shifted. Staff began fanning out, checking behind enclosures, calling his name. One of the volunteers found Noah's backpack by the fence near the goat pen, the zipper open, the contents undisturbed. His sandwich remained untouched. By 11:15, the police were on site. The zoo was locked down. Parents were corralled into a shaded picnic area, their faces tight with panic. Sarah Franklin arrived 10 minutes later, breathless and pale, her eyes searching the crowd with a mother's desperation. When no one could tell her where her son had gone, she sank to her knees in the dust. Somewhere, under the bright sky of what was meant to be a joyful school outing, a quiet terror had begun to take root. Noah Franklin was gone. The sound of his name rippled through the petting zoo, sharp and urgent, layered in rising notes of fear. "Noah? Noah, sweetheart, it's time to regroup," his teacher called, her voice tight, already tinged with something she didn't want the children to hear. Her clipboard trembled in her hand as she counted again, slower this time, lips moving with each name she silently ticked off. Still, only 23. She felt it in her chest like a drop in altitude. The kind you try to ignore. The other teachers and parent chaperones joined the chorus. "Noah, hey buddy, time to go." One by one, the children began to notice the sudden shift, their carefree laughter ebbing into confused silence. A girl clutched her stuffed llama closer. A boy asked if Noah had gone home early. Sarah Franklin wasn't yet at the scene. She had waved goodbye to her son that morning with a thermos in one hand and a kiss on his forehead, trusting that this field trip would be like any other school day. But across town, her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. She let it ring once, then twice. And by the third ring, something inside her snapped to attention. She answered, and within moments she was in her car, running red lights, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her in one piece. Back at Willow Acres, staff moved quickly but uneasily. An employee, barely out of high school, was sent to the back gate to ensure it was locked. Another swept through the feeding stations and equipment shed. The barn was checked, then the restrooms, then the snack area. Each came back with the same 2 words: "Not here." One of the parents pointed to the goat pen, where a low wooden fence separated the animals from the children. "He was here. I remember he was laughing at the baby goat chewing his shirt." The fence was intact. No signs of tampering, just Noah's backpack sitting beside the fence post, as though he'd set it down carefully before wandering off. But where? At 11:15 a.m., the police arrived, their flashing lights painting harsh colors over the soft edges of the petting zoo's pastels. Officers moved swiftly, questioning staff, reviewing footage from a single outdoor camera, outdated, grainy, and mostly useless. The zoo was sealed. No one in, no one out. Search dogs were brought in, but they circled the grounds with growing frustration. The scent trail disappeared near the fence, as if Noah had simply stepped into thin air. By early afternoon, the mood had shifted from fear to disbelief. A little boy had vanished in broad daylight, surrounded by teachers, classmates, animals, and adults, and no one had seen it happen. By dusk, the air outside Willow Acres was heavy not with humidity, but with microphones, camera lights, and the restless thrum of unanswered questions. The zoo's cheerful signage and cartoon animal cutouts, once backdrops for laughing children, now framed the faces of anchors wearing grave expressions. News vans crowded the roadside, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like metal flowers in bloom. Reporters jockeyed for angles, cables snaked underfoot, and the smell of diesel from the parked trucks hung in the air alongside the scent of hay and panic. Sarah Franklin stood behind a line of police tape, her hands clenched at her sides, knuckles white. She had barely spoken since arriving hours earlier, her voice caught somewhere between hope and the edge of a scream. Now, with cameras fixed on her like spotlights in a nightmare, she blinked against the brightness and stepped forward. "We're asking anyone who may have been in or near Willow Acres this morning to come forward," she began, her voice hoarse, raw with exhaustion and restrained hysteria. "Noah is 6. He's shy around strangers but talks to animals like they're friends. He was wearing a red dinosaur t-shirt. He's just a little boy." She paused, and for a heartbeat, the world stilled around her. Behind the cameras, someone sniffled. Another whispered, "God, she looks so young." A breeze tugged at Sarah's hair, strands catching against the curve of her cheek like a mother's hand brushing away tears. "If you have him, please bring him back," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't have to explain. Just leave him somewhere safe. No questions. Just bring him home." The reporters didn't move. They held their microphones steady, eyes fixed, waiting for something more, some dramatic unraveling, some burst of grief they could cut into a segment. But Sarah had nothing left to give. She stepped back, turned into the arms of a police officer, and disappeared behind the yellow tape once more. Throughout the night, the story replayed on every local station. Missing boy at petting zoo, 6-year-old, disappears without a trace. Photos of Noah blinked on screen as school portrait with an uncertain smile, a blurry snapshot of him holding a pumpkin last fall. Neighbors lit porch lights. Facebook exploded with theories, false leads, and prayer chains. And far from the clamor of the cameras, the petting zoo stood eerily quiet. The goats bleated softly in their pens, unaware that a single, inexplicable moment had turned their home into the center of a nightmare no one could yet wake from. The morning after Noah's disappearance dawned pale and brittle. A low fog had crept in from the river overnight, curling around fence posts and hovering above the dew-drenched fields. It made everything quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath, but even the hush couldn't muffle the growing urgency that had gripped the town. Search crews gathered at first light, some in official vests, others in whatever they could grab from their closets before racing to the scene. Neighbors, parents, off-duty deputies, hikers, and strangers who'd only seen Noah's face on the news but couldn't look away, they all came, clutching maps, radios, coffee, hope. A line of volunteers stretched across the tree line behind Willow Acres, methodically stepping through underbrush, eyes scouring the forest floor for anything: a red t-shirt, a shoe, a sign of life or loss. Dogs barked and strained at their leads, their noses low and eager, then frustrated as the scent trail thinned and vanished entirely not far from the back fence. A drone buzzed above the treetops, scanning with infrared, but the screens in the mobile command unit showed only patches of warm woodland, and the occasional deer, startled and fleeing. Helicopters swept overhead, their blades thumping like mechanical heartbeats. From above, the petting zoo looked like a toy diorama perfectly still, its painted pens and cheerful animal murals an unbearable contrast to the chaos unfolding within its borders. The goat pen, where Noah had last been seen, was cordoned off with bright orange tape. The backpack had been taken in as evidence. By midday, the questions turned inward. "How well do you know your staff?" one officer asked the zoo's owner, a soft-spoken woman named Leanne Sutter. Her answer came quickly, too quickly. "They're all background checked, good people. But doubt settled like dust on every surface. Cameras weren't working properly. Maintenance logs were spotty. There were gaps in the staff schedule, employees who clocked in late or not at all. Someone whispered that Edgar Brill, the goat caretaker, had shown up with fresh scratches on his arm that morning. When pressed, Edgar claimed a goat had panicked during feeding. "They get like that sometimes," he said, voice low, avoiding eye contact. His alibi was thin. No one remembered seeing him between 10, 15, and 11. 0 the exact window when Noah vanished. But still, no fingerprints, no evidence, nothing to hold him on. Not yet. As the sun slid behind the hills, the search continued. Voices echoed through the trees, calling his name, and the forest, as if complicit, gave no reply. Edgar Brill sat at the edge of a folding chair in the break room of Willow Acres, his knees close together, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were bloodless. A half-empty bottle of warm orange soda sweated on the table in front of him. He hadn't touched it. Across from him sat 2 detectives, their notepads open but still blank, waiting for the man to offer something that would bridge the chasm between his presence that day and Noah Franklin's disappearance. He looked like someone who had never learned to take up space. Mid-50s, gray hair thinning unevenly, a permanent squint like the world was always a bit too bright for him. His coveralls bore smudges of straw and dirt and something else that might have been dried milk or something worse. He smelled faintly of goats, but that wasn't unusual. He'd been the goat caretaker at Willow Acres for nearly 8 years. "I was in the feed barn around 10:30, he said, his voice flat and soft, like he was repeating something memorized. "Checking the hay bales, then I filled the water trough. After that I took a break behind the shed, wasn't feeling too good." One of the detectives leaned forward. "Anyone see you during that time?" Edgar shifted in his seat. "No. I work alone mostly. Don't much like crowds." It wasn't a crime, being quiet, being odd. But Edgar's isolation had become a spotlight, and in that spotlight every quirk sharpened into something suspicious. He didn't own a smartphone. He lived in a trailer behind the petting zoo, though his official address was somewhere else. He didn't talk much, never joined staff lunches, and when he did speak, it was always with a sort of dull hesitance, as though he was waiting for someone to misinterpret his words. A volunteer had mentioned seeing him return to the goat pen just before 11:00, appearing sweaty, flushed. Another said they'd seen scratches on his arms, though goats could easily explain that. Edgar offered no explanation for the time between 10:20 and 10:55, except to repeat, "I wasn't feeling well. I sat behind the shed." They searched his trailer, neatly kept, almost obsessively so. A mattress on the floor, a shelf lined with labeled jars, goat medication, brushes, clippers, books about animal care. A single framed photo of a woman no one could identify. Nothing linking him to Noah. No red shirt, no stray hairs, no blood. Just silence, dust, and the scent of hay. The detectives closed their notepads. For now, he remained a man with no alibi and no proof of guilt, just a shadow that didn't quite match its source. The tip came in just before midnight, called in by a woman working the late shift at a roadside diner 2 counties east of Morningdale. She said she saw a boy maybe 6, maybe 7 eating fries in a booth with a man who looked too old, too distant to be his father. The boy didn't speak. He had light brown hair, big eyes, and wore a red shirt with some kind of dinosaur on the front. Within the hour, state troopers were dispatched to the truck stop along Route 31. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as officers scanned the booths, interrogated the cook, and reviewed security footage that showed exactly what the woman had described. A boy. A man. Fries on a shared plate. But when they zoomed in, the boy's face didn't quite match Noah's. The hair was darker, the eyes not as wide. And then the timestamp, 3:0 p.m. The boy had shown up 6 hours after Noah was last seen. There was no way he could have made it that far without someone noticing. The man in the video had paid cash and left no trace. The booth was wiped down. The tip was generous. It all led to nothing. 2 days later, a fisherman found a small blue and red backpack tangled in a cluster of reeds along the banks of Pine Creek, just 12 miles from the zoo. He hauled it in with shaking hands, heart racing. The zipper was broken. Inside, a sandwich wrapped in plastic, a juice box, and a crumpled drawing of a sheep. It was soaked, the ink bleeding. Forensics took it within the hour. Sarah Franklin didn't sleep that night. She sat in the living room clutching Noah's school photo, jumping at every sound, waiting for the call that would confirm what her heart already knew. But by morning, the detective's voice was apologetic. "It's not his," he said gently. "Different brand. Different name written on the inside. We've contacted the school. It belongs to another boy. Not Noah." Outside, another candlelight vigil had been planned. People brought signs, stuffed animals, flowers, but the crowd was thinner this time, the candles shorter, the prayers quieter. Reporters started leaving. The zoo reopened its gates with a skeleton staff and a nervous energy, as though something could still be watching from the trees. False leads had replaced hope, and every day that passed without answers became its own kind of grief, thick and shapeless, settling over everything like a fog that refused to lift. In the weeks that followed Noah's disappearance, the house on Sycamore Lane grew unbearably quiet. At first, it was filled with movement neighbors, bringing casseroles, reporters leaving voicemails, detectives stopping by with updates that sounded more like apologies. But then the noise thinned, the calls slowed, and the silence crept in like mold, settling into the corners, making itself at home. Sarah sat at the kitchen table most mornings, her coffee growing cold beside untouched toast. She kept Noah's backpack on the counter, zippered shut, untouched since the day she packed it. She would reach for it sometimes, only to pull her hand back as if it were hot. The house still smelled faintly of him shampoo, peanut butter, crayon wax, and that scent became a thread she clung to. Proof that he had been here, that she hadn't imagined the last 6 years of her life. Mark, meanwhile, had stopped speaking much at all. In the first few days, he was constantly checking the locks, reprinting flyers, hounding the police. But as each lead collapsed under the weight of nothing, so did he. By the 3rd week, he was coming home from work and going straight to the garage, where he sat in the dark with the door half open and a bottle of whiskey he kept hidden behind the tool bench. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried a sharper edge. He didn't want to talk about feelings. Didn't want to attend the vigil Sarah organized at the park. Didn't want to see another headline, another false promise of a break in the case. "You think screaming his name into the wind will bring him back?" he snapped one night, slamming a drawer so hard it cracked. Sarah didn't reply. She just stared at him, hollow and exhausted, knowing they were both falling apart in opposite directions. But she couldn't sit still. Not when other children were vanishing across the country, their faces filling the same flyers Noah's had. So she started the Franklin Initiativa, small but fiercely determined group focused on supporting families of missing children. She gave interviews, hosted fundraisers, wrote articles. She learned legal codes she never thought she'd need. It gave her purpose, or at least the illusion of it. And yet, in bed at night, she reached across the sheets for the man she had built a life with, only to find the space beside her empty more often than not. The hole Noah left had grown so wide, it was swallowing everything, including them. The barn stood at the edge of the property like an old wound gray, leaning and hollowed out by time. It had belonged to Dean Whitaker's uncle, a man he barely knew, whose passing had left him a patch of land he hadn't asked for and didn't expect. The deed had arrived folded inside a legal envelope, along with a short letter scrawled in uneven handwriting, "Do something good with it." Dean wasn't sure what that meant, but he took it as a sign. After all, his life had shrunk to the size of an apartment kitchen and a job he hated. The thought of open fields and quiet animals held a strange kind of appeal. So he packed what little he owned, left behind the concrete hum of city life, and drove north until the streetlights disappeared and the radio turned to static. He arrived in early spring, when the hills were still dusted with frost and the trees had just begun to shake off winter. The farmhouse needed more work than he had hands for, but it was standing. The barn, though its roof sagged in the middle, one side was completely overgrown with ivy, and a family of raccoons had taken up residence in the hay loft. Dean started with the animals. A few goats, purchased cheap from a retiring farmer, their ribs visible beneath patchy coats. He fed them, named them, patched their pen. Every morning, they greeted him with indignant bleats that echoed through the valley. It was the closest thing to conversation he'd had in years. Then he turned to the barn. Day by day, he cleared debris, pulled out rusted tools, broken crates, a rusted bicycle that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. He replaced rotting boards, swept away nests and droppings, shored up the stairs that led to the hayloft. It became routine: chop, lift, fix. The repetition soothed him, and with each repaired board, he felt something settle in his chest. It was on a Tuesday morning, 12 years and 3 weeks after Noah Franklin vanished from Willow Acres, that Dean first noticed something odd in the loft. A disturbed pile of hay, a shape that didn't belong. Something or someone had been sleeping there. At first, he thought it might be another raccoon. He climbed the creaking steps with a broom in one hand and a flashlight in the other. But when he reached the top and swept the beam across the shadowed corner, he froze. There, half hidden beneath hay and torn blankets, were two wide, terrified eyes staring back at him. Human, young, and very much alive. The morning was quiet except for the goats. They bleated like clockwork, impatient for their feed, nudging the fence with their noses until Dean gave in and trudged out with a scoop of grain. A light breeze carried the scent of soil and hay, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out once, then again. Dean tossed the grain into the trough, scratched behind the ears of the smallest doe, and turned toward the barn with a bundle of baling twine slung over one shoulder. Inside, the air was thick with dust and sunbeams. The restored boards still smelled faintly of fresh-cut pine, though most of the wood was aged soft in some places, sharp in others. He'd made good progress on the loft, repairing the rotted ladder rungs, replacing cracked floor planks, stacking the new hay bales along the back wall. It had become routine, solitary, predictable, which is why the sound stopped him cold. It was subtle, but Riala rustle overhead. Not the scratchy scrabble of raccoon claws, nor the flutter of pigeons startled by light. This was heavier, slower, the sound of weight shifting through hay. Dean stared up at the loft for a moment, listening. Nothing. "Great," he muttered, grabbing the broom. He had evicted a pair of squirrels last week and figured this was more of the same. He took the ladder slowly, 1 foot at a time, careful not to put too much weight on the side rail. When he reached the top, he hoisted himself over and rose to his feet, brushing the dust from his jeans. Then he saw them. Eyes. They were wide and rimmed with dirt, shadowed by the loft's low light. The figure was curled in the corner, half wrapped in a blanket so frayed it barely held shape. A boy or maybe a teenager. It was hard to tell, thin as a rail, jaw too sharp, hands balled into fists like a cornered animal. Dean's breath caught. He didn't move. "Hey," he said softly, the broom forgotten at his side. "It's okay." The boy didn't reply. He stared back with a terror that rooted Dean to the spot, as if his next breath might spook him into vanishing. "I'm not gonna hurt you," Dean added, taking a single step forward. The boy flinched hard, like a whip had cracked. Dean stopped moving. The silence between them stretched taut. This wasn't some runaway from town. This wasn't a prank or a break-in. There was something in that stare hollow and desperate that said this kid hadn't seen a stranger in a long, long time. The boy moved before Dean could say another word fast, wild, like an animal caught in the corner of a pen. In one breath, he was crouched, and in the next, he lunged for the open edge of the loft, feet scrambling through hay, arms slashing the air. Dean shouted, stumbled forward, and managed to grab a handful of flannel at the boy's shoulder just as he reached the ladder. They toppled together, hay flying, limbs colliding in a frantic tangle. Dean grunted as his back hit the floorboards, the boy twisting like a snake in his grip, but he was too weak to break free. His limbs flailed with desperation, not strength, and when Dean finally rolled to the top, pinning him with his hands on the boy's arms, he realized just how thin he was. The kid was bones and sinew under filthy clothes. His sweatshirt hung off him like it had once belonged to someone twice his size. The fabric was threadbare, cuffs chewed and stained, the kind of clothing you didn't get from a closet but from a garbage bag left at a donation bin. His jeans were worse torn at the knees, crusted with mud and blood, or something close to it. And his face. God. His face. Dean had seen rough living before. He'd spent a few months couch-hopping in his 20s, knew the signs of someone who had fallen through the cracks. But this boy, his skin was pale and papery, stretched too tight across his cheeks. His lips were chapped raw. There were faint bruises along his neck that looked neither new nor healed. Still he fought. "Hey! Hey!" Dean gasped, trying to steady his voice. "I'm not going to hurt you, I swear. I need you to stop." The boy froze like someone had thrown a switch. He blinked once, then looked away, breathing hard through his nose. Silent. Utterly silent. Dean slowly eased off him, hands raised. The boy didn't bolt again. Instead, he curled in on himself, spine against the wall, arms tight around his knees. Only then did Dean notice the bedding, if it could be called that. Tucked into the corner were scraps of blanket, a pillowcase stuffed with hay, an old jacket layered beneath it all. Nearby, a tin can half full of rainwater and a flattened cereal box used as a kind of tray. This wasn't a hiding spot. It was a home, or the closest thing to one this boy had. Dean swallowed hard, heart pounding. Whoever this kid was, he hadn't just stumbled into the barn. He'd been surviving here, alone, for longer than anyone had realized. Dean made the call with shaking hands, pacing in the gravel outside the barn as the boy sat motionless in the loft. He hadn't moved since Dean let him go. Just sat there, knees drawn to his chest, eyes locked on a fixed point in the wood, as if looking anywhere else might shatter something fragile inside him. Dean kept glancing up at the loft, half expecting the kid to vanish like a ghost the moment he turned his back. The 911 dispatcher didn't quite know what to make of the story. "You found a teenager living in your hayloft?" she repeated, voice cautious. "No, he won't speak. He's not armed. He looks sick. Just send someone," Dean said, more urgently than he meant to. "He needs help." The cruiser rolled in 40 minutes later, kicking up dust as it came up the long drive. 2 officers stepped out, a young patrolman and an older woman with salt and pepper hair tied in a low knot. They looked skeptical until they saw Dean's face, the way his hands trembled despite the warm sun overhead. Then they followed him to the barn. The boy hadn't moved. "Hey there," the woman officer called gently, standing at the base of the ladder. "We're police officers. We're not here to hurt you. We just want to talk." "Nothing. Can you tell us your name?" He blinked, but said nothing. Dean watched from a few steps back, arms folded tightly across his chest. The officers climbed the ladder one at a time, slow and calm, like approaching a wounded animal. When they reached him, the boy didn't flinch, but his breathing quickened. He curled tighter. They checked for ID, nothing in his pockets but lint and a rusted key that looked like it belonged to a locker or a padlock. No wallet, no phone, no documents. "Can you write your name?" the younger officer asked, kneeling beside him with a notebook. Still nothing. Back on the ground, they radioed for a social worker and a medic. The boy was escorted gently from the loft, wrapped in a blanket from the cruiser. He walked stiffly, like his joints hadn't stretched fully in a long time, and he never once looked up from the ground. At the station, the mystery deepened. No local missing child reports matched his age or description. His fingerprints came up blank. It was like he didn't exist. Then a detective passing by suggested facial recognition. "Run him through the state database. Maybe we'll get lucky." They did. The results came back 30 minutes later. The boy in the hayloft had a name. Noah Franklin, missing since age 6, gone without a trace. Until now. The confirmation came through at 3:17 p.m., buried in a string of digital notifications that blinked across the screen in the precinct's back office. Facial recognition software had scanned state and national databases, compared the boy's gaunt features to a pool of unresolved missing children, and found a match. 100% certainty, no discrepancies. Noah Franklin, 18 years old. Missing for 12. The name hit the room like a dropped glass, sharp, sudden, and impossible to ignore. The detective stared at the monitor, then read the case summary slowly aloud, as though afraid speaking it too quickly might shatter the moment. Abducted from Willow Acres Petting Zoo, last seen at age 6. Declared legally dead in 2017. Someone whispered, "Jesus." Across the hall, the boy sat in an observation room, a fleece blanket draped around his shoulders, a plastic cup of water untouched in front of him. His hands were tucked beneath his thighs, legs drawn up on the chair like he was trying to disappear into himself. He hadn't spoken a word since arriving. Not to the officers, not to the nurse, not to the woman who'd offered him a sandwich and a soft voice. When asked questions, he simply stared, not vacant, but unreadable, as if language had become a foreign concept, or perhaps too dangerous to use. They took another photo of him, this one under better lighting. The resemblance to his childhood portraits was undeniable. Same curve in the brow, same distant gaze. But the boy in the old photos smiled easily, a missing front tooth on full display, cheeks rounded with youth and joy. The boy in the chair looked older than 18. Not in age, but in weighted invisible burden draped over his frame, pressing his shoulders down and hollowing his eyes. The news spread quickly. A phone call to the Franklin home. A stunned silence on the other end. Sarah didn't speak for several seconds after hearing the name. When she did, her voice cracked. "Say it again, please. Just say it one more time." The detective did. In the waiting room, Dean Whitaker sat quietly, hands clasped together, still wearing the barn dust on his jeans. He hadn't left since they brought Noah in. "It's him, isn't it?" he asked one of the officers who passed by. The man only nodded, eyes wide. 12 years. For 12 years, Noah Franklin had vanished into the static of memory and false hope. Now he was here, silent and alive, a ghost stepping back into the world that had already grieved him. The drive to the station was a blur Sarah would never remember clearly. One moment she was clutching the phone to her ear in the living room, the voice on the other end calm, steady, saying things like, "We believe it's him," and a positive match through facial recognition. The next, she was speeding down rural roads, her fingers clenched so tightly around the steering wheel they turned bone white. Mark was at work, unreachable, and she hadn't wanted to wait, couldn't. She kept telling herself it wasn't real. It couldn't be. 12 years had passed since Noah vanished from that petting zoo, and in those years, she'd buried pieces of herself just to survive. She'd grieved, hoped, relapsed, and even accepted against everything in her that he might never come back, and now someone was telling her he had? When she arrived, the officer at the desk didn't need to ask who she was. He just nodded solemnly and led her down a quiet hallway, past rooms with closed blinds and humming lights. Every footstep rang in her ears like a heartbeat, each one pulling her closer to a truth she wasn't prepared to hold. "He's in here," the officer said softly. The door opened with a low creak. The air inside smelled faintly of antiseptic and something warm, maybe a sandwich someone had tried to offer him. Sarah stepped inside. And then stopped. The boy sitting at the table didn't move at first. He stared down at his hands, which were resting awkwardly in his lap, as if he wasn't sure what to do with them. His hair was longer than it had ever been. His frame stretched out tall and thin, like a sapling that had grown too fast in too little light, and his face, God, his face. The bones were sharper now, and the skin beneath his eyes bruised by years she hadn't seen, but there was no mistaking him. "Noah," she whispered, the name tearing itself from her throat. He looked up. It was that moment that broke her. Her knees buckled and she hit the floor with a gasp, the air knocked out of her by the weight of everything that had been lost and now, impossibly, returned. Tears blurred her vision, but through them she saw those eyes sought her, yes, and hollowed by something he still hadn't spoken of, but still her son's. Noah didn't run to her. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But he watched her, and in that gaze was the faintest flicker of recognition. The first thread pulled taut in the unraveling of silence. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beep of machines monitoring nothing urgent. A nurse moved gently in and out, checking vitals, adjusting cords, making notes on a clipboard without asking questions. Noah sat propped against two pillows in the corner of the bed, eyes fixed on the window. Outside, a robin hopped along the sill, pecking at nothing. He didn't blink when it flew away. Sarah sat nearby, barely breathing. She had brought a photo album with her Noah's 5th birthday, his kindergarten graduation, the last Halloween costume he ever wore. A red cape. A homemade Super Noah logo across his chest. She placed the album carefully on the tray beside him, hoping he might glance at it. He didn't. They'd tried to reach him every way they could. Gentle questions from detectives. Soft encouragement from trauma specialists. Even silence. The kind that fills a room and waits. But Noah offered nothing in return, not even a shake of the head. His voice, if it still existed, remained locked behind an invisible door. "He's not physically mute," the doctor had explained quietly outside the room. "There's no damage to his vocal cords, no neurological signs of impairment. This is something else, something psychological. He's shut down." Sarah had nodded, numb. She understood shutting down. She had done it herself, in small ways, over 12 long years. But this was deeper. This was survival, masquerading as silence. Noah flinched when the nurse accidentally dropped a thermometer on the floor. He jumped when a tray clattered in the hallway. The sound of footsteps near the door made him shrink into the sheets, his hands gripping the edge like a child afraid of being taken again. When the psychiatrist came, he tried pictures instead of questions. Flashcards with simple images, a house, a goat, a school bus. Noah stared through them. But when he was shown a photograph of a Loft, old black and white image pulled from a reference book, his eyes locked onto it for a beat longer than the rest. His jaw tensed, his shoulders twitched. But still, not a word. Sarah sat beside his bed long after the sun dipped below the windowsill, her hand resting near his but not quite touching. She spoke softly, telling him about the things he'd missed, about how his room looked exactly the same, about his father's silence, about the dog they almost adopted but couldn't bear to name. Noah said nothing, but his breathing slowed, and for the first time since she had found him, he closed his eyes. Not in rest, but maybe, finally, in safety. The first drawing appeared on a dinner napkin, soft lines pressed faintly by a pencil Sarah had left on the tray. She found it when she returned from a hallway coffee breaker, hand trembling slightly as she lifted the napkin, recognizing the shape before she fully understood what it meant. It was a goat. Not a cartoon. Not the kind you'd expect from a child who once doodled rocket ships and stick figures with lopsided smiles. This was detailed. Careful. The angle of the horns, the slope of the back, the thin rope of a lead drawn taut in the background. A second goat followed 2 days later, this one penned behind slats of wood, a bucket overturned beside it. Noah had drawn the eyes with too much weight, the kind of weight that said he'd spent years memorizing their shape. Sarah didn't ask him about them, not directly, but she brought him a sketch pad, left it by the window with a box of pencils, said nothing more. Noah didn't look at her, but that evening she found him drawing again, each picture more precise, more unsettling. A hayloft came next. Viewed from below, drawn in perspective, with stair rails leading upward into shadow. Dean came to visit that afternoon, bringing fresh goat milk in a glass jar, awkward and quiet. He spotted the drawing, leaned in, and went pale. "That's the loft," he whispered. "That's my barn." He's remembering it. Noah didn't react. He kept shading in the corners of the room, darkening the beams until they looked like they could collapse from the weight of whatever had lived there. But it was the man with the cane that changed everything. Drawn from behind, broad-shouldered, one leg slightly bent, a curved wooden cane in one hand, the other resting on the head of a goat. The man's face wasn't visible, but there was something in the posture rigid, familiar, that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. She showed the image to the detective the next day. "We've got staff photos from Willow Acres," he said, "from the time Noah disappeared." A few hours later he returned with a printout. An employee ID photo, Edgar Brill, goats and all, and in his right hand, a cane. When Sarah showed the picture to Noah, he didn't speak. But his fingers twitched against the edge of the sketch pad, and his pencil rolled slowly off the tray and fell to the floor. Not an accident. A tremor of memory. A signal that something buried was starting to stir. The sign had faded. The cartoon goat that once smiled beside the words, "Willow Acres Petting Zoo," now bore chipped paint and a lopsided grin. The place looked smaller somehow, like time had curled its fingers around the edges and squeezed. The laughter of school children had long since faded, replaced by a quieter hum of weekend families and birthday balloons tied limply to fence posts. New owners had taken over 3 years ago, rebranding slightly, repainting fences, but some things hadn't changed. Edgar Brill was still there. He wasn't easy to find at first. The woman now managing the zoo, a brisk, middle-aged woman named Donna, seemed surprised when detectives arrived and asked for him. "Edgar still comes in early mornings to feed the goats, keeps to himself. Why?" They didn't answer. Donna led them past the pens, past a cluster of children tossing pellets into a sheep enclosure, until they reached the back shed. It was smaller than most of the barns, sun-bleached and leaning at one side, with a crooked door that hung slightly ajar. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and sour milk. Edgar was there, hunched over a trough, scooping oats into a rusted pan. He didn't turn when they entered. "Mr. Brill," the lead detective said. The sound of the scoop continued, slow, methodical. "Mr. Brill, we'd like to ask you a few questions." He paused then, straightened a little, turned, slowly. The years had grayed him, thinned his frame, deepened the lines at his mouth. But the cane was still there, hooked on a nail behind him, like a familiar companion waiting to be needed. His eyes flicked up briefly, then dropped again. "What's this about?" he asked. The detective held up the ID photo from 12 years ago, the one that matched the drawing in Noah's sketchbook. "You remember this boy?" he asked. "Noah Franklin." Edgar said nothing. He glanced at the photo, then looked away. "We'd like to know what you remember from that day." "I told everything I knew back then," he said softly. "I wasn't near the kid. I was feeding the goats." "We're asking again," the detective said, his voice quiet but firm, "and we're not just asking." Edgar's hand found the edge of the trough, gripped it. "I've done nothing wrong," he muttered. But when they asked again, when they pressed just a little more, he stopped speaking entirely. The goats bleated behind him, shifting uneasily in their pen. And the man who had stayed at the same job, on the same land all these years, would not meet their eyes. The shed was barely more than a lean-to at the far edge of Willow Acres, wedged between the woods and the outer pasture, half swallowed by bramble. It leaned like an old man who'd taken one too many bad winters, its roof bowed and patched with tar paper that flapped in the breeze. Donna, the new manager, had mentioned it only in passing. "We don't use that one," she'd said. "It's full of junk. Probably hasn't been touched since before I got here." But something about it had stuck with the detectives. A place ignored, left alone. The kind of place someone might choose if they didn't want to be found. They pried the door open mid-afternoon, the light angling low across the zoo grounds. Inside, Dust motes swirled in slants of sun, cutting through warped boards. The air was stale, layered with the smell of dry rot, old fertilizer, and something sour underneath. Shelves lined the walls, bowing under the weight of rusted tools and plastic buckets brittle with age. A forgotten wheelbarrow leaned in one corner, its wheel flattened, a ragged tarp draped across it like a shroud. But it was the floor that caught their attention. In the far corner, beneath a thin mat of straw and discarded feed bags, the boards didn't quite match. One rectangle stood out, paler than the rest, newer or at least less worn. When one detective stepped on it, the sound changed, hollow. They cleared the debris. Dust spiraled in tight whirlwinds as they uncovered the trapdoor. A rusted latch, the kind made before safety codes mattered, held it in place. When they cracked it open, the hinges groaned, long and aching, as if protesting their intrusion. A ladder descended into darkness. They called for backup, lights, gear. When the second team arrived, they dropped down carefully, feet landing on a packed dirt floor. The space was small, no more than 10 by 10. Low ceiling. Stone-lined walls, damp with the slow crawl of time. And signs of habitation. An old mattress lay against one wall, mold blooming along its edges, torn blankets. A child's plastic cup in the corner. Scratches etched into the stonetizens of them, clustered like tally marks or nervous scribbles. In one corner, a stack of yellowed paper, drawings, crude, familiar. A goat, a loft, a man with a cane. The cellar was silent, but the walls whispered of years no one had seen. Years spent hidden, beneath the feet of visitors, parents, teachers. All while the boy everyone was searching for had been just a few steps beneath them. Waiting. Alone. Silent. Forgotten. The forensic team moved carefully, their boots disturbing the dirt in slow, deliberate steps. The cellar's walls were close, pressing in with the kind of weight that made every breath feel shallow. It wasn't just a space, it was a container, a memory soaked into stone and soil waiting to be exhumed. They started with the pile in the corner, a nest of sorts threadbare blankets stiff with age, the mattress stained and sagging in the middle. Beneath it, tucked into the shadows, were items that hadn't been touched in years. A red plastic truck with one wheel missing. A set of broken crayons bundled together with a rubber band. A paperback book missing its cover, pages stuck together with what might have once been juice or glue or something else entirely. And the drawings. There were dozens, some crumpled, others folded with care. Pinned under a stone was one with the faint outline of a boy's face, no mouth, just eyes wide and blank. Others showed a hand clutching a cane, or a narrow window looking up at a square of sky. Over and over, in the margins, a goat appeared, sometimes drawn lovingly, with flowers at its feet. Other times, its eyes were hollow. Its mouth bared teeth. Closer to the base of the wall, an officer found strands of hair blonde, brittle, clinging to the cracks in the stone like spiderwebs. They were carefully collected, sealed, logged. Every inch of the room was treated as sacred, and, in a way, it was. Not because it was holy, but because something had been taken here. Childhood, voice, time. The DNA results came fast, expedited because of the circumstances. The hair matched the samples taken from Noah, as did the traces found in a cloth scrap under the mattress: sweat, blood, skin. He had lived here, been held here, survived here. They cataloged the rest. The scratched tally marks on the wall. The spoon bent into a makeshift lockpick. The worn spot near the ladder where small heels had paced again and again and again. When the detective returned to the hospital with the report in hand, he didn't know how to deliver it. He handed it to Sarah without speaking. She read it once, then again, her face paling with every line. Her lips trembled, not with shock, she had always suspected it had been something this dark, but with the ache of knowing now, finally, that her son hadn't disappeared into thin air. He'd been caged, beneath their feet, inches away from the world, and no one had heard him. It was late when Sarah found the drawing. The hospital room was dim, lit only by the glow of the small lamp near Noah's bed. He was asleep, or at least pretending to be his body, curled toward the wall, eyes half-lidded but tracking every movement when he thought she wasn't watching. She didn't speak to him anymore when he was like this. She simply sat nearby, quietly flipping through the sketch pad he kept beside the window. Most of the pages were similar to the other's goats, the hayloft, the man with the cane drawn in dark, angry strokes. But as she turned another page, something changed. The drawing was different. It was a map. Rough, childlike, but unmistakable. A rectangle labeled with little squares and crooked line spans, a barn, what looked like the zoo layout from above. And off the edge of the page, behind a shaded patch of trees, a long, snaking corridor that curved away into thicker lines brushes, marks, almost like hatchings. It ended in a dark circle, a kind of tunnel mouth, the paper torn slightly at the edge where the pencil had pressed too hard. Sarah stared at it for a long time. The next morning, she brought it to the detectives. They studied it carefully, comparing it to old blueprints and aerial photos from the zoo's development archive. Some buildings had changed over the years. Sheds torn down, fences rebuilt. But the topography was the same. And that corner of the map, the one where the tunnel veered, offled directly to the tree line behind the pasture, a patch most had assumed was too dense for exploration. A search team assembled within the hour. They combed through the underbrush, machetes slicing through years of overgrowth. Brambles clawed at their boots. Mosquitoes whined in their ears. But then, one of the officers stopped, called out. Just beyond a collapsed section of split-rail fence, hidden under a camouflage of vines and dead leaves, was a slab of plywood, old, warped, partially buried. They pulled it away. Beneath it, a dark opening, not natural. Reinforced by timber, the mouth framed with rusted nails and the stale smell of earth and mildew drifting upward. A tunnel, narrow, man-made. Designed not for comfort but concealment. They shone a flashlight down. It stretched straight, sloping gently downward, the walls packed tight with soil. No obvious footprints now, but signs of disturbances, cuff marks, scrap cloth, fingerprints where hands had gripped the walls. The tunnel was real. The drawing hadn't been a memory twisted by trauma. It was a map, a route, an escape path, or a secret passage. A clue that had waited, silent in pencil, until someone thought to read it for what it truly was. Proof, direction, and the unspoken confirmation that Noah hadn't just been trapped, he had tried to find his way out. Edgar was in the goat pen when they came for him feeding time again, same as always. The sun had barely crested the trees, casting long shadows over the pasture, glinting off the tin pails he lined up like sacred ritual. He didn't hear them at first. The goats bleated, nuzzling his side, chewing at his sleeves, pulling his attention in harmless directions. Then he saw the cruisers. 2 unmarked cars, one black and low-slung, the other a dull brown sedan that had seen too many winters. Uniformed officers stepped out, followed by 2 detectives and a woman with a clipboard county investigator. No one spoke at first. Edgar's back stiffened, his hand frozen on the handle of a feed scoop. They called his name. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned slowly at first, like he might pretend not to hear, like he could still walk away if no one said anything too loud. But then the officer in front held up the sketch. The one Noah had drawn, the man with the cane, the goat, the posture. They said the name out loud. Noah Franklin. That was when Edgar dropped the scoop. He didn't bolt like a guilty man in a movie. There was no burst of adrenaline-fueled sprint. Just a sudden pivot, a stumble through the gate, and a half-limping lurch toward the equipment shed behind the main barn. His cane clattered to the dirt, forgotten. His breath rasped in the cold morning air. The officers moved fast. He didn't make it far. They brought him down in the gravel behind the feed silo, 2 bodies pinning his arms, a third wrenching a key ring from his belt. He struggled, not like someone trying to escape justice, but like someone terrified of what was coming. "You don't know," he kept muttering, face pressed to the ground. "You weren't there. He needed me." Back at his trailer, the warrant was served. The home was sparse, meticulously organized. But behind a false panel in the bedroom closet, they found boxes, dozens, old keepsakes. Clippings from the newspaper about Noah's disappearance, locks of hair tied in ribbon, a photo of a 6-year-old boy taped inside a cabinet. Below it, the words scrawled in pen, "Still mine." One drawer held Polaroids. Not all of them were dated, but one creased and faded showed a child lying on a dirt floor beside a flashlight and a goat's chew toy. The search stretched into the evening. By nightfall, the pieces had begun to connect. And the man who had once simply seemed strange quiet, off was no longer a question mark. He was a storm long overdue. The story came out in jagged pieces. At first, Edgar said nothing, just sat in the gray-walled interrogation room, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on a crack in the tile floor. But then the photographs were laid in front of him, and the drawings, and the DNA results, the tunnel, the hair, the mattress. Every thread he had tried to bury now laid bare, woven into a single, undeniable truth. "I never hurt him," he said at last, his voice hoarse, cracked from disuse or denial. "Not really." The detective said nothing, only leaned forward slightly. Edgar stared at his own reflection in the mirror across from him. He was lonely. You don't understand. He needed something better than the world had given him. 12 years. That's how long Noah had been gone. But not all of it was spent in silence. Not all of it underground. Edgar's story, once unwound, revealed something more chilling than isolation. It revealed deliberation, planning, a broken logic dressed in the language of care. It had started with the cellar, the one beneath the old feed shed dug years before by a former owner for storing crops during frost. Edgar had found it during his early days at Willow Acres, reinforced the ladder, added blankets. He knew the layout of the zoo better than anyone, knew the shift changes, knew which cameras had blind spots. He waited until the field trip was at its busiest. Then, he took Noah. "He didn't scream," Edgar claimed, "just followed me. I think he thought it was part of the tour." For 2 years, the boy lived in that dark earthen box. 2 years with no sunlight, no school, no parents. Edgar brought him books, food, paper to draw. Called him Simon. Said it was a new name, a better one, for a better life. He kept goats nearby, claimed it gave the boy comfort. But then the zoo changed hands. New management, more staff, new inspections. So he moved him. The property had come through a distant cousin left to Edgar with no ceremony, just a signed deed and a handwritten note. A goat barn in the middle of nowhere. He cleaned it out, boarded up the windows, reinforced the hayloft. Built it to contain. He liked it better there, Edgar said, almost proudly. More space. The goats were gentler. By then, Noah didn't fight. He didn't speak. He existed in silence, shrinking inward like a flame starved of oxygen. And all the while the world kept turning. Families grew older, flyers faded. Sarah and Mark learned how to live without their son, never knowing he was watching the seasons change through cracks in wooden slats, just waiting for someone to open the door. But no one did. Not for 12 years. It happened on a rainy afternoon, the kind that painted the hospital windows in streaks and made the world outside feel distant and soft, like a memory you couldn't quite hold on to. Sarah had stepped out to meet with the social worker, and Noah was alone in the room, his sketch pad open in his lap but untouched for hours. He sat curled against the corner of the bed, eyes fixed on the water trailing down the glass, his breath fogging a small patch at the edge of the window pane. The nurse had just entered to change the linens when it happened. "Edgar." The word slipped out so quietly she almost didn't hear it. She turned, unsure if it had come from the hallway or the flicker of the television on mute. But Noah's lips had moved. He was staring at the nurse now, eyes unblinking, the name still hanging in the space between them like something fragile and unfinished. He said nothing more that day. But it was enough. Word spread through the hospital within the hour. Sarah returned to find the nurse sitting quietly in a chair near Noah's bed, tears in her eyes. "He spoke," she whispered, as if saying it louder might frighten the moment back into silence. After that, the words came slowly, like pebbles pried from beneath hardened earth. a sentence here, a name there. At first only in response to simple questions yes, no, sometimes. But then, one night, when the lights were low and Sarah had curled up in the recliner with a blanket over her legs, he spoke without being asked. He said my name was Simon. Sarah didn't move, didn't even breathe. He said my old life was broken, that he was fixing me. His voice was quiet, almost detached, like he was repeating something learned by rote, but the emotion seeped through. A kind of tremor, barely there. Noah talked about the cellar first. How cold it was. How he counted the days by scratching marks into the walls until he ran out of space. He talked about the goats, the only living things he was allowed to touch. He described the tunnel. How Edgar made him crawl through it in the dark, carrying his own blanket and food wrapped in newspaper. How he was told the world had ended, that people had stopped looking, that his parents were gone. He told me no one wanted me anymore, Noah said, eyes cast down. That I was lucky to have him. Sarah listened, her heart breaking open anew with every word. She didn't interrupt, didn't cry. She let him speak until his voice cracked, and the silence returned, not because it was forced, but because he had said enough for now. The silence had broken. And for the first time in 12 years, Noah's voice was his own again. The courtroom was cold, not in temperature but in atmosphere, a place where every movement felt magnified, every breath carried weight. Reporters lined the back row, their pens poised and eyes unblinking, while members of the public filed in and filled the gallery in silence as though entering a cathedral before confession. The judge, an older woman with silver hair swept into a tight bun, brought order with a single glance. She didn't smile. No one did. Edgar Brill sat at the defense table in a pale blue shirt and outdated tie, his posture stiff, hands folded neatly on the table as though this were a job interview and not a trial. He had pleaded not guilty. His lawyers argued diminished capacity, delusion, trauma. That he hadn't kidnapped a child, he had rescued one. They called it a misunderstanding warped by grief, a tragedy, not a crime. Then Noah took the stand. He walked slowly, still thinner than most 18-year-olds, but steadier now. His clothes hung loosely on him, and his voice, though quiet, carried. The courtroom held its breath. He told them everything. How Edgar took him from the petting zoo, saying his parents had forgotten him, that something bad was coming. How he led him to the cellar and told him it was safer there, that it was home now. How the darkness pressed against him like a weight. How he stopped crying after the first week because it made the air feel thinner. He spoke about the hunger, the way meals came irregularly, sometimes warm, sometimes spoiled. About the cold winters in the barn, wrapped in hay and silence, with only the goats for warmth. About the name Simon, and how it took him months to remember that he'd once been called Noah. And then he described the punishments. When he disobeyed, Edgar didn't yell. He simply withdrew food, light, voice. Noah described days spent alone in the dark, the sound of footsteps above, the only reminder that the world hadn't ended. The courtroom did not move. A reporter dropped her pen, and the sound startled half the room. Sarah, seated just feet away, never looked away from her son. When he finished, there were no gasps, no applause. Just the steady hum of reality setting in. The judge called for recess. And outside, under the waiting crush of cameras and microphones, the world began to understand what 12 years of silence had really meant. It was not just the theft of a childhood, it was the quiet, methodical erasure of a life and the unimaginable strength it took to reclaim it. The verdict came on a rainless Thursday, the kind of gray, unmoving day that seemed chosen by fate for somber conclusions. The courtroom was full, just as it had been from the start, though this time the reporters sat quieter, their pages already filled with headlines half-written, "Justice for Noah Franklin." The Goat Barn Captive Speaks. Edgar Brill didn't react when the sentence was read. Life without parole. No possibility of release. No chance to retreat into the quiet anonymity he had once used as a shield. He stared ahead, not at Noah, not at the judge, not at anyone, just the wall. as if it might open up and give him a tunnel of his own. Sarah wept silently. Not out of relief, because there was no relief, but out of something heavier. Finality. The sound of it in the courtroom was like the closing of a door. Noah sat beside his mother, hands clasped in his lap. He didn't flinch, didn't cry, but his fingers trembled slightly against the cuff of his sweater. His eyes stayed locked on the bench, the place where the law had spoken, where the last ghost of Edgar Brill's control had been buried. The public rallied around him. Letters arrived from across the country, some from other survivors, others from strangers who had only seen his face on the evening news and felt the need to say, "You matter." A nonprofit offered to fund his education, if and when he was ready. Someone sent a hand-carved goat figurine, its note signed simply, "For the boy who never stopped being brave." But behind the kindness, the grief still lingered. It had sunk deep into Noah's marrow, into the places no court could touch. He began therapy almost immediately, 2 sessions a week, then 3. His therapist specialized in trauma recovery, someone who understood the kind of silence Noah had lived in. Progress came slowly. Sometimes it was a word, other times just a shift in posture, an easing of breath. He drew less, spoke more, walked without checking over his shoulder. But the scars didn't vanish. He couldn't stand the smell of hay. He flinched at the sound of goats bleating, even through a television screen. He still slept with the lights on, and sometimes, on the bad nights, Sarah would find him curled on the floor beside his bed, blankets cocooned around him, just like the hayloft. There was justice now. But justice is not a balm. It doesn't rewrite the past. It doesn't unchain the years. It simply marks the moment when the world agrees something wrong has happened and names the one responsible. Grief, however, is something else entirely. Grief lingers long after the gavel falls. The backyard looked smaller than Noah remembered, though he couldn't tell if it had truly changed or if time had just stretched his memory. The fence was still the same white picket design, chipped now in places, and the garden Sarah once struggled to keep alive was blooming again, wild and imperfect, but alive. A wind chime tapped gently in the breeze near the porch, its song soft, uncertain, like it too was learning how to sound again. Sarah sat across from him in one of the old lawn chairs, her legs curled beneath her, a mug of tea cooling in her hands. She watched without speaking as Noah crouched in the grass, coaxing the baby goat forward with a handful of grain pellets. Its name was Olivia, tiny black and white thing with knobby knees and eyes too big for its head. Sarah had adopted her on a whim, a reckless act of hope, or maybe defiance, against everything that had been taken from them. Noah didn't resist the gift. He hadn't said much when she brought the goat home, just nodded once and took the leash gently, fingers brushing the frayed fabric like it was something delicate, something rare. And now, weeks later, Olive followed him like a shadow. She nudged his arm with her nose, bleated once, then settled down beside him as if she'd been born into this life. The sun dipped low, bleeding gold across the sky, casting long shadows that stretched over the lawn. Noah reached out, stroking Olive's back slowly, his fingers careful, reverent. "She trusts you," Sarah said quietly. He nodded. "I know." They sat in silence for a while, not because they had nothing to say, but because some things could only live in quiet. This was a moment that didn't need explaining. It simply was. A boy once lost. A mother who never stopped searching. A goat who had never known the dark corners of a cellar or the sound of a bolted latch. "I didn't think I'd come back here," he said finally, voice low. Sarah looked at him. What changed? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned down and kissed Olive gently on the head. "I think I wanted to remember what safe felt like." And for the first time since his return, Sarah didn't feel the weight of everything they'd lost. She felt the flicker of something else. Something returning. Something alive.